All right, welcome to the conversation on the TYT Network. We got a great guest for you guys today. It's John Nichols. He's been with the nation for a long time. He's their national affairs correspondent. He's also the author of The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party. And I love that. I want to talk about that. John, welcome back to the Young Turks.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, my friend.
All right, good to see you, brother. All right, so let's just start out nice and easy. What soul? No, seriously. Seriously, what's the fight? Progressives know a lot about it, but a lot of times mainstream media says, what? There is no fight. Nancy Pelosi agrees with the progressives 100%. I don't know why you guys are dissatisfied.
Well, I think we know that's not the case. And so this book is really a product of a lot of work over many, many years. It is at once a history and an examination of the moment that we're in. And the bottom line on it is that since the end of World War II, when Roosevelt passed away in April of 1945, 75 years ago, the Democratic Party has really had a brutal battle within it between progressives who had a vision for, really addressing the fundamental problems of the country, and centrist corporate Democrats who have repeatedly undercut and undermined them, sought to marginalize them, have used the structures and the regulatory power within the party to limit internal democracy, but also have, as you suggest, benefited from a media that tends to want to treat political parties as just simplistic entities that have no dynamics within them. And so what I tried to do with the book is really begin with the concept that political parties are entities. They evolve, they change, they become better, they become worse, but they also have factions within them that are incredibly powerful and that fight with one another. And what I really wanted to do was also remind people that many of the fights that progressives have fought over the last 75 years have been for issues that we now see as completely acceptable, completely responsible, completely necessary. And it's a way of saying that the fights that progressives raise today will, in not that long a time, be seen as responsible, necessary, required, and yet are today dismissed. So it's really just a challenge to the party in the way that it operates.
It's amazing how long this fight's been going on. So tell us a little bit about Henry Wallace and how the corporate Democrats took him out.
Well, it's such a good story, and I'd love to spend the whole show talking about it, but I know we don't have that much time. But Henry Wallace was a progressive Republican. He had supported Teddy Roosevelt and Robert M. La Follette in the presidential campaigns of the teens and 20s. He became increasingly dissatisfied with the Republican Party as the Depression rose. He was a farm advocate from rural America. And so Franklin Roosevelt reached out to him, and Wallace aligned with Roosevelt at the start of the New Deal. He was one of the handful of people who walked into the White House with Roosevelt at the start of the New Deal and was there through the entire period. For 2 terms, he was Secretary of Agriculture, by far the most visionary and activist member of the administration. Roosevelt, in 1940, at a point when he wanted to really move the party to the left, there was simply no question that that was what he was thinking about, brought Wallace in as vice president. He basically forced the party to accept Wallace. It was a very grudging acceptance. And then over the 4 years that Wallace was vice president, he did something that was very radical and very appropriate to now. He said, look, we're in a really big fight. World War II, it's absolutely all-consuming. We have to be focused on it. But we also have to recognize that coming out of this fight, we have to win the peace, that winning the peace is as big a deal as winning a war. And what he said was the only way the United States would do that was by addressing racism and sexism and imperialism and a host of other aspects of the United States experience that he identified as great challenges and said, you got to do something about it. And at the core of it was the message that you did need to create something much more akin to a social welfare state than what we've got. And they beat him out of the party for that.
Henry Wallace is the vice president. If he remains the vice president going into the next election, that's obviously when FDR passed away, and he would have been president instead of Harry Truman. So they wound up replacing him at the convention with a far more conservative VP. That's Truman. And instead of talking about racism, Truman actually, even though he did some good things like integrating the army, would refer to black people as mud people. Or he might have referred to Asians as mud people, but he said things that were horribly, horribly racist, and so was not in the liberal wing. He was in the conservative wing of the Democratic Party. So how did the people in power get rid of Henry Wallace? Because now they just do it through campaign contributions. We won't give you any contributions if you don't do what we tell you. How did they do it back then?
Well, the party was much more controlled by bosses, by elites, and by factions. And so during the course of the 4 years that he was vice president, or really 3 years coming into 1944, Wallace had offended two very powerful groups within the party. He offended the big city bosses because he said that the way that they operated was not the way to do either politics or governance, that it had to be equitable and fair. But he especially offended the Southern segregationists. And people need to remember that at that time, the segregationist wing of the Democratic Party was huge. It was the solid South, if you will, the underpinning of the party. And so he offended these two groups. They pressured Roosevelt, who was in the midst of fighting World War II and was very focused on that, and frankly was aging and was not in the best of health. And they really pressured him to essentially allow a quote-unquote open convention, right, or not to put his thumb on the scale in favor of Wallace. Roosevelt accepted that, and we can't, it shouldn't be denied. He stepped back from that fight. He wrote a letter to the convention saying that if he personally was a delegate, he would vote for Wallace, but he didn't say the convention had to do that. They basically tried to exclude Wallace from the process, and then here's where it got fascinating. They allowed him on the stage of the convention as the incumbent vice president of the United States only for one purpose, and that was to second Franklin Roosevelt's nomination. Wallace went to the stage, and remember, at this time, polls showed he was overwhelmingly popular with the American people. He was a extremely popular political figure across the country, especially with communities that have been excluded politically and a lot of other aspects. So he goes to the convention, he delivers a very short speech, and he basically says everything that you're not supposed to say. He says, we got to get rid of the poll tax. We got to fight racism. We have to be a party that treats everyone as human beings. He was respectful of women. He talked about in the post-war era creating massive numbers of jobs so that the war economy could be converted to a peace economy. I mean, it was this very bold speech. And the wild thing about it was the convention went crazy. They started cheering wildly, and it was clear to Wallace's floor manager at the time, Claude Pepper, that Wallace could be renominated. So Pepper started racing to the stage to just call for a vote. And he was a U.S. Senator from Florida at the time. So he's racing to the stage calling for a vote, and they gabbled the convention out of order. They closed it down and prevented a vote. And then the next night, next day when they came back to the convention, whole different ticketing process, and all sorts of people who had been on the floor couldn't get on the floor. And they just basically wired the convention, the old smoke-filled room situation, and Wallace was narrowly defeated.
Between the AOC wing and the Pelosi wing, certainly in the short term, I won't even argue it, the Pelosi wing has won and will continue to win. But who winds up winning in the long term and the midterm?
What I argue in the book, which is both a history of the past, but very much comes right up to the present. In fact, it closes with a quote from AOC. Is that the times are forcing America and grudgingly even the Democratic Party to catch up with reality. And so I think that the AOC wing, if you will, does prevail eventually, but it will be a brutal fight, and no one should neglect that fact. In fact, one of the problems that progressives always have is that they don't realize they're in a fight. And I'm not saying you or any particular person, but too frequently progressives think, oh, yeah, the party kind of believes what we believe, and we just have to be more convincing, or we just have to have a better candidate. And one thing that you need to understand is that again and again and again, the party undermines the visionary candidates. And so if you begin with the concept that this is a fight, it's gone on for 75 years, and you've got to be organized to go forward with a vision that, and it may take years, it may take decades, but if you understand you're fighting for something and it is a fight, then the possibility of winning becomes much greater. And frankly, the realities of our times, 30 years of globalization, 20 years of digital revolution, 8 to 10 years of automation revolution, now in combination with coronavirus and the other crises that we have, mass unemployment, create an opening that we may not have seen since Franklin Roosevelt came in, since Wallace served. And so progressives ought to recognize that and seize it, not for crass political purposes, but because their vision, what they seek to achieve, is actually now more necessary than ever.
So, John Nichols, is always a pleasure. Thanks for coming on, brother.
It's an honor to be with you, brother. Stay strong.
On the go? Don't worry, we got you covered. You can still listen to TYT at our new podcast network. Find us on Apple Podcasts, the Google Play Store, or at tyt.com/podcast.